Good afternoon, or good morning for those of you joining us from across the Atlantic. Thank you for joining the third in a series of conference calls and webinars, which is part of ongoing joint work between the Migration Policy Institute Europe and the International Migration Initiative of the Open Society Foundations. The goal of these is to discuss what is next regarding the current European asylum crisis. We speak today as events continue to shift. Numbers arriving from Turkey to Greece remain high, with the majority still passing through the Western Balkans and on into the rest of the European Union. The scenes at Europe's borders remain chaotic, with the Croatian-Slovenian border now taking centre stage and colder weather beginning to be felt. As Greece and Italy struggle to implement a hotspot concept that will allow them to relocate 160,000 asylum seekers throughout Europe, key agencies such as Frontex, Europol and the European Asylum Support Office have been thrust into the limelight to support those countries and others in implementing the scheme. 5 years ago, indeed 2 years ago, the context passing or reforming the cadre of asylum legislation and the mantra amongst policymakers.
Demetrios, maybe.
Yes, Rob, why don't we start while waiting for Liz to rejoin us? And the first question that Liz wanted to ask you is to reflect on the last 5 years, EASO, for the benefit of the audience. You were the founding director of the organization, and it would be useful for all of us if you were to sort of step back now that your 5-year term has expired, to step back and talk a little bit about the changes that you have seen both in Europe over the past 6 to 12 months, how those changes have affected the development of EASO, and what do you foresee for EASO in the next year or so? In other words, what's the agenda? What should the agenda be for your successor?
Thank you, Demetrios. It is a challenging time to leave office just now. It also shows how unforeseeable the situation and how dynamic the situation in the asylum world is. When I announced my departure, in line with the expiration of my contract, it was only four and a half months ago, when everything was relatively quiet and stable. Things were under control. There were some movements, but the big dynamic that we have seen recently wasn't there at all. So that in itself shows the special area of asylum compared to many other areas. There are quite a lot of people that speak about an asylum crisis or a European crisis. I would 3 years ago and in which people, a world that was totally different from the world now. There was no discussion about the Ukraine. Syria was relatively quiet. Iraq didn't start it. ISIS no one has heard of. Libya was in a transition, but not quite clear what direction. And parts of Africa were unstable, but that has been for 10, 15 years at least. In a very short time frame, that world outside of Europe has changed. That's where the crises are. Europe has to deal to manage the results of that crisis because people seek a safe haven in Europe. But let's not forget that it's not Europe in crisis, it's the rest of the world that is in crisis. Looking back at the 5 years and at a recent time and an organization, an agency like EASO, what I see is that in a relatively short period of 5 years, EASO as an agency has established itself. If the demands from the political field, from the council, from the ministers, from parliament, from national organizations, to step up even more the support, then I think you can only value this as a result of the work that has been done in the last 5 years. Starting from something that was totally unknown, that was, at least at a number of member states and partners, a suspect new organization, becoming now an established and normal partner. And I think that is a great compliment to my team that has been able to do and to perform in this way, and they for sure will continue in this direction.
Liz, welcome back. I asked Rob to discuss the first question that you wanted him to discuss. Great. So we now surrender the chair back to you.
I'm not entirely sure when you lost me, but I'm assuming it was fairly early on. So, Demetrios, tell us, from your vantage point across the Atlantic, and with your experience both as a Greek national and a US national, tell me, what do you see as the main challenges of the asylum crisis right now?
Well, I like to think of this as a migration crisis as well as an asylum crisis. Rob just finished saying that the team that has been put together and that he has led, which I had the privilege of addressing less than a month ago, I believe, is a remarkable team. The camaraderie, the commitment that they have to these issues is extraordinary. And I think that as a result, the EASO is resilient enough to be able to handle the crisis in a smart way, given the expansion of funding and mandates and responsibilities, etc., which are beyond EASO's portfolio, as it were. As Rob said, this depends very much on Brussels and member states. But I recall conversations that I had with Robert when he was trying to sort of get things organized in Greece about 2 or 3 years ago, with the crisis that Greece had at that time. And it impresses me a great deal that so much has changed. I was in Greece last week and I found that the asylum system that has been developed under the leadership of an extraordinary director there, Maria Stavropoulou, is just about as good as I could have imagined. I have no other reference points in terms of other European asylum systems, but nonetheless, I was quite impressed. Now, the crisis has been, has grown immensely. It has been chaotic, as you mentioned. As Rob mentioned, it reflects the instability in the region, and my bad news, as it were, for today is that instability will only grow, that it will include more and more countries, most of them, of course, in Africa rather than the Middle East. The Middle East is already enough of a mess. But I am worried about not just the countries that are producing all of these refugees and other migrants, like Syria and Iraq. I'm really worried about the countries that may very well be close to the precipice in terms of being unstable enough to actually threaten or at least create possibilities for outflows becoming chaotic out of there. And I am pointing out to places like Egypt, for instance, or some of the places in the sub-Saharan Africa. These places are only 1 or 2 steps away from producing a large number of refugees, which leads me to suggest 2 things. The first one is we had better invest whatever political, policy, financial resources and pressure on these countries to make sure that their unstable situation does not become chaotic. Because once it becomes chaotic, there is very few things that you can do. The second one is that we better be prepared for these kinds of numbers to actually continue to grow and to continue into the next year. So simply saying that we're going to take all these people, which is the amazing, remarkable comment by Angela Merkel, is not going to be enough.
Thank you, Demetrios. And so, Rob, given this prognosis for the European Union and the relief you must feel at no longer being in the hot seat, can you tell me what you think Europe's first priority should be in terms of actually responding to what will likely be a continuing flow of people to the European Union?
Let me first say that in a situation as of today, it's not a relief not to be in the chair anymore. It feels uneasy in a way, but that's how life is. What is the situation and how to handle it? I agree with most of the things that Demetrios said. We should invest, we should have invested, let's not forget that we are late already, in the neighboring country, Ukraine, because that is a highly politicized situation where probably no other actions would have been possible, even in retrospect. But certainly in Libya, in Tunisia, in Syria, and in Iraq. I mean, we were only a little more than a year ago claiming, and with good reasons, that Iraq was very safe, that people would go back to Iraq, that we were rebuilding Iraq, and now suddenly it has changed in a dramatic way. Will this continue? We don't know. There is only one prediction that I feel fit, even in my actual position, but anyhow on migration and asylum, that every prediction is wrong. There's no prediction that has come true. No one predicted Libya, no one predicted Syria, no one predicted ISIS. So it's good to work in scenarios because you have to. But it's also good to realize that things might change from one day to another. That is why, as an agency, we have been investing in contingency planning and trying to by benchmarking, to build up the capacity also of member states that at a certain moment do not feel like being in the front line. But suddenly they can be. Austria, as an interesting example, has a very solid, good reputation, but suddenly the numbers become such that even a good, well-organized system like the Austrian one comes into trouble. If you see what happened in the last months at Calais, everybody is concentrating on the other side of Europe, but we're building fences. Well, member states are building fences between two member states, preventing people from one side to the other. That is also a reality. That is also some sort of migration, because it's more than an asylum only. I agree with Demetrios. If it's more like a migration subject, then in the end, the use of the asylum. But that's also part of it. It's not only the south, it's not only the east.
Thanks, Rob. And if I can ask a follow-up question, because you talked about contingency planning and the need to really deal with the realities of the crisis, particularly in the southeast border. In the future, is there a stronger role for EASO to suddenly marshal resources and make sure that resources reach crisis moments and crisis regions far more quickly than we've seen in the last few months? One of the big challenges has been, as numbers started to increase in the Greek islands, but then also through the Western Balkans, there seemed to be a continued lack of capacity, and also some of the crisis response mechanisms didn't kick into action. Is this something EASO can and should be taking on in the future, or should they really be maintaining an operational support approach whereby they help member states respond more quickly?
I would say both. The approach we have chosen from the very beginning is a step-by-step approach. That's important because you're new. People don't know what to expect. And in this sort of highly politicized, let's be clear about it, highly politicized area, if they don't know you, they're at least a little suspicious. So you have to earn the place. What we have been doing is, at the one hand, being very much concentrating on practical support, practical assistance, practical advice, practical handouts, and at the same time, when we saw something, behind the scenes, speaking to member states and say, this is what we see. If you share our analysis, then we can support you. We have the system, the operational system to support you. If I look at the future, then I see a much bigger role in this respect. But never over a member state. Going to, I said, invade Greece. Don't be afraid. We only work if you ask us. But once we agree on the analysis and we agree that something has to be done, then EASO should, I think, have increased capacity, and the recent decision from the European Council to increase that capacity quite considerably is a good sign in that direction, that also the member states now, step by step, understand that this is the new direction to go.
Thanks, Rob. Demetrios, just turning to you, I'm sure, having spent much of the last week in Greece and also in the Greek islands, how much of this crisis response do you see taking place in that region? Do you think the hotspots will actually help in this endeavour? Is this something you can speak to in terms of whether Europe's up to the challenge of dealing, A, with the crisis, and B, moving into management?
Thank you for setting me up, Liz. I think that the hotspots was a good idea, June, or perhaps even earlier. I think it reflected a misunderstanding, miscalculation as to how large the flows would be and how overwhelmed the places through which most migrants would come, such as Greece. There is a concern in Greece that unless there is a massive resettlement or relocation, I should say, of people from Greece, Greece and all the centers that they have will be completely overwhelmed. I happen to have been in Greece when the first 20 or so people from the islands could be relocated, were supposed to be relocated to Luxembourg, and something fell through and this didn't happen. I understand at the end of the week that things were working a little better than that. And I know that we need to start with a number, but I must say that, as the person who doesn't mind saying the emperor has no clothes at all, the idea that the concept of hot spots would somehow solve to a certain degree, or at least, create conditions for doing things better, in Europe, I find it a bit preposterous. Greece does not have the capacity, it does not have the space, it does not have pretty much anything that is needed to be able to relocate people from the islands or the mainland to wherever it is that they are to be relocated in Europe. What this leads me to is to talk a little bit about the recent movements on the part of the Commission and the Europe, I should say, in trying to strike a deal with Turkey about Turkey taking more responsibility and becoming more of a principal actor in this particular crisis. And we all know the difficulties with that, starting with the political difficulties, that President Erdogan is someone that will leverage these conversations to the maximum and try to gain an advantage in the elections that Turkey will have on the 1st of November. 2, questions as to whether post-election Turkey is going to be a reliable partner. 3rd, that Europe will know exactly what it is that it can ask of Turkey and what it shouldn't ask of Turkey. That the €3 billion is going to be enough of an inducement for Turkey to really play the role that people envision that it should play. All of those things suggest that these are going to be difficult negotiations that have not been completed, but I'm focusing on the implementation of whatever is agreed to. And I think it is in the implementation end where we have to be particularly careful. And we also have to be very careful not to think that somehow Turkey is the magic sword that will solve all of Europe's issues with regard to this migration and refugee crisis. There are many other things that we all know that Europe will have to do. The Commission suggested a 200,000 resettlement plan, resettling 200,000 refugees over whatever period that would be is a drop in the bucket. By that I mean it is not going to change the calculus of would-be refugees and migrants. It won't stop them from trying to come regardless, and is still going to require an awful lot of political capital here in Europe in order to actually have those 200,000 people resettled. So we're a long way from really turning the corner on this, but I'm a bit optimistic that finally the European Union is beginning to think more in a more integrated way and more comprehensively about how to address the crisis.
One of the questions, we've now opened up for questions from anyone who's listening in. So if I can say, you can tweet to @migrationpolicy and use the hashtag MPIDiscuss. You can email us at events@migrationpolicy.org and feel free to send your questions in. We've already had quite a few. And one of those questions is really the role. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, if you tweet to MPI to @migrationpolicy with the hashtag MPIDiscuss, or email events@migrationpolicy.org, you can ask questions to Rob and Dimitri. And one question that's already come in, Rob, and I think this is pertinent for both of you. We've had some talk about the role of NGOs and the role of local authorities and other actors during this crisis. How far do NGOs play into the work of EASO? How important do you think they will be in the coming months? And how might the EU support the work of NGOs to either increase resettlement or increase the success of resettlement and relocation? Do you see an increased role in the future, and if not, why not?
Well, if not, I see it. So that is the question I don't need to answer. There's absolutely an important role for NGOs in the whole process, as there has been from the very beginning. I saw some remarks in the press earlier today from a spokesman of ACRE that surprises me a lot. NGOs are involved from the very beginning in each and every step that we take. What I with the NGO world is that they are sorry that we do not have more actual powers. That is not something you can reproach an agency. There you should be at the political field, who is the only one that can change that. Having said that, the NGO world is extremely important because they are important in most of the member states in the migration fields. For example, the counseling, the information function. Some NGOs, for example, in Greece, who are specialized in translation and interpretation services, and we're all using them, and more trying to bring them to the forefront. But it is uncertain. I mean, only 2 months ago, nobody could explain the word hotspot. Nobody knew exactly what it was. So don't blame anyone that everybody had to look for answers. And still, I mean, I just spoke about 160,000 people to be distributed in a fair and humane way. That is not something that we have already in blueprints up till the final comma. That is something we really have to discover. So you can ask the questions, but better would it be to be in the dialogue, and I very much invite the NGOs and the NGO world in a daily contact on this.
Let me say a word or two about that, too. Clearly, the NGOs are critical actors in every aspect of this migration and refugee crisis, in the management of the crisis. My concern, and I think Rob's point about being patient, you have to start somewhere, you have to then ramp up, etc., is an extremely valid point. But what I see, in a sense, is that whatever it is that we may be planning, in other words, a reception and initial adjudication centers, call them hotspots, call them whatever it is, the fact is that the 160,000 is not going to be 80,000 per year, is not going to be anywhere nearly enough, number one. And number two, that now would-be refugees and migrants who are mixed with refugees, economic migrants, vote with their feet. In other words, the government can decide whatever it is that they want to decide, that they want to take, 25 of them or 75 of them and send them to Spain. But what if they do not want to go? And I don't mean if they get to Spain and then they want to move wherever they want to move, which is most likely Germany or Sweden. I'm talking about what if they refuse to actually be relocated. Europe has not tried to think the implications of the fact that now refugees vote with their feet, that they can become easily aggressive, that they will not do things that they do not want to do, that they have these exaggerated notions of their rights. You see on television pictures and people talking about they were forced to give their fingerprints. Well, you have to use some sort of suasion. I don't want to use the word coercion, but suasion if you're going to move people from place A to place B and they don't want to be there. And these are the kinds of things that EASO and the rest, of the people involved in this relocation situation will have to confront. And that is something that also needs to be planned. Rob is the only one, I think, in EASO that has actually done the necessary contingency planning. We need to go much deeper than that. Everybody needs to be engaged in this, and we have to develop what-if scenarios. What if a group of 35 refuses to be put on a plane? What do we do then? We cannot send them away, particularly if they've already been qualified as refugees, and we cannot force them onto planes. So all of those things, these are among the consequences that the chaotic situation has created that need to be put on the table if we're going to have rational conversations about all of this.
Thanks, Demetrios. And that, I think, brings us to one of the questions we've had, which, it's clear that certain asylum systems are proving more attractive than others, notably Germany, but also Sweden and several more. And there's a question over whether there is an incentive for those countries that currently have very little capacity and currently have asylum systems that are in evidence more on paper than in practice, to build up to the standards and to the level that some of those more experienced countries have reached. And so one of our questions, and I think, Rob, you've been talking to member states for the last 5 years, is it just a lack of capacity and experience that is stopping many of these countries build out their asylum systems, or is there a fundamental lack of political will and incentive? And if so, how do you overcome those?
No, there's something fundamental, but in a different area. more and more confronted with the success of our exercise. It sounds maybe very strange, but we have done a very, I think, solid study on the systems in the member states, and more and very much closer to each other. Where is the difference? The difference is for the, that means is that areas that are not harmonized, there it's equal before the national law. So once you are accepted as an asylum seeker in the area or in Sweden, you're treated and your package is the same as your neighbor in that country. And that is where the differences arise much more, and that is what in the foreseeable future we will not change. The package you get as an inhabitant or a citizen of Sweden, or the package you get as a citizen of Bulgaria, I just take two examples, but you can take any other country and compare like this, is a totally different package. You get exactly the right asylum status as we have harmonized. The consequences for your living conditions, for your future, for your family, etc., are different. That is one of the big things. We will not change that, because changing income system, changing the economic parameters, changing the social security or health system, that is not something that we will go for in the European way in the coming years, so far for forecasting. But there is more to it. Some examples we have, evidence we have, shows that is not something that is forever. You see sometimes very swift changes. You saw 3 years ago where Belgium couldn't handle the numbers of asylum seekers, and they were sent on the streets and etc. Terrible pictures. Then for 2 years they had a total overcapacity and very low numbers. Now suddenly it's going up again. You see the same in other member states. So it's very common to say it is Germany and Sweden, but that is not supported by permanent evidence. Second, which is at least as important, we concentrate on those who qualify for refugees. We have very big numbers compared to the past, but still 50% of them do not qualify. And it used to be much larger numbers. That is one of the ways in which Europe should be much more organized and clearer, that those who do not qualify, that come for migrant reasons but not for refugee reasons, should be refused. 50% of those applying in Germany are at the very beginning of the process already know. That is a huge number. And I'm not only speaking about budget and processes and civil servants, I'm also speaking about the social consequences of this. If we don't dare to say as Europe, these people come from a country that is considered to be safe, and in principle they do not qualify and they are not going to spoil our system, then already we would have taken a major step in the situation of this moment.
Thanks, Rob. To follow up on that, what role do you think the safe country of origin concept has in effecting greater return? And do you think Turkey has a place on that list, or are we just focusing on the low-hanging fruit of Western Balkan countries in order to effect that kind of triage?
My answer is very simple. I am a believer, as I said before, in a step-by-step approach. Let's take the large numbers. Western Balkan is a huge number. Turkey is not that big number. And it is much more complicated because the numbers, the statistics, etc. are different. Maybe it will one day, but let's start with an area where the maximum recognition rate is 1 or 2%, which is a clear indication situation is different from, say, Syria or Iraq.
Demetrios, some thoughts on this?
Yes, thank you. Rob, it's very hard to not agree with Rob because he's such a rational person and he's systematic, both in his thinking and his actions. But Rob, you said refused. It's not just refused. It's refused and returned. In other words,
exactly what happens in the Western Balkan. That's also why the Western Balkan is interesting, because the vast majority of Western Balkans can be and are returned.
Right. But these are not the only people who are not qualifying as refugees or are not able to attain subsidiary protection. There is a significant proportion of the total who are found to be economic refugees, economic migrants, and they are refused refugees or any other protection status, and then they are released to the community. That, in a sense, puts governments and states and publics in an untenable situation. I think, from my perspective, it is incumbent upon governments when they ask their publics to give this extraordinary reception to those people who are refugees or otherwise deserving of protection. It is incumbent upon these governments. They owe it to their publics to remove those people who do not qualify. So here is another blind spot in which typically the EU talks a good game, and when you look at the numbers, if you take Spain out of the equation, the numbers are insignificant. In other words, I know that we have to do it systematically, piece by piece, gain acceptance, build the institutions and the processes and move on and on and on. But at the same time, we have to acknowledge that there are some hard things that we also need to do. And those hard things are going to have always been difficult. And to go back to the concept of hotspots, the idea that somehow Greece would be able on its own or with assistance from the EU to hold people for 3 or 4 months before it can actually remove them and return them is not a reasonable assumption. I've visited the reception facilities that they have prepared, and they're facilities that have been prepared for transitory populations. So the Greeks are playing a good game, the same game that everybody else is playing. As long as everybody comes to Greece, and Greece understands that once they do some of the things that they're supposed to do, those people will simply move on. And the Greek government and civil society and smugglers of all types will facilitate their progress all the way to Macedonia and then go up from there. Everything's okay. But once you start stopping people and having to do something with these people in numbers that will grow very, very quickly, then you develop a problem. That is how you begin to lose the support of the people. Here we're talking about a situation where the first victim of this disorganization in so many different parts of Europe is trust. And trust is essential. The trust between the governors and the governed, between institutions and their clients, across institutions, between member states and Brussels. So I think that we're having a problem that needs to be addressed comprehensively in an integrated way.
Thank you for leading perfectly into my next question, Demetriou, which is, if trust is at the center of many of the solutions at hand, we've heard a lot about cooperation with third countries in recent weeks, and in a couple of weeks, EU heads of state will get together with African Union heads of state and discuss their own cooperation.
It is about the external dimension and the third countries, but...
Go ahead. We'll talk until it gets back.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Let me say a few things about it. I fully agree also with Dimitri, what you said before, that we should invest much more in the world around us. Because if there is a crisis, I still maintain that the crisis is the crisis externally. It is useful to put it like that, because that's where the source is. If you don't change the source, then it's very difficult to manage forever the numbers that might come this way. So going to source, which is highly geopolitical, it's really not an asylum situation. Asylum is a result, maybe, but certainly not the course of the situation. It's very important. Should EASO go more in the external dimension? I'm mixed in that. As far as we have value, yes, of course. But if you look at Syria, for example, what could an organization, an agency like EASO do in Syria at this moment? We could just go to Turkey. Turkey, just as an example, you can say Tunisia, Morocco, there are more countries. But at this moment, it's focusing on Turkey. On Turkey, we do. We help them with training their officials. We have a training program already in Turkish to support them. So that's a useful thing. I don't have the pretension that in itself, at least, or in Turkey, and you can take any other countries. So I don't claim for EASO a prime role in external dimension, but a supportive role wherever it's necessary, absolutely.
And Rob, since we lost Liz again, do you anticipate that should the agreement with Turkey, welcome back, I think, Liz, he already, we figured out what we figured out what the rest of your question was, and Rob has already answered it. So with regard to to Turkey that you mentioned, Rob, if indeed this idea that part of that money will be used to create additional places, reception and initial adjudication centers in Turkey, possibly, housing another 1 million or 2 million people, do you expect the EASO to play a role at those reception centers, together, of course, with UNHCR and other organizations?
I can imagine such a role. I'm very much impressed already from the beginning of the Syrian conflict in the role of Turkey, how Turkey has positioned it. This is really a tremendous lot, and the quality of their reception is at a reasonable to high standard, which for such large numbers is quite well. You can praise them for that, to say the least. At the other hand, we should not underestimate. We have seen that in the long Iraq War in 2006, and that majority of people don't want to leave the region. They want to go back. They want to go back where their parents or their grandparents were buried, where they have houses, where they have families, where they have memories. And that's a very normal thing. So let's not pretend that tens of millions will come to Europe. That is not, there's no evidence for that ever. Nevertheless, the numbers will be big, and as the conflict goes on, will increase. That is also a fact of evidence. What would EASO do in a situation that you would have an enlarged cooperation with Turkey? I think just the point that I mentioned before, training of the officials, certainly an enlarged role will mean more officials, more people, more staff. That is something we have proven capacity, proven ability, but also the maintenance, the setup of reception centers, where now in Greece, in Italy, in Bulgaria, in Hungary is starting to become an expert organization in how to set up, how to manage these large projects together with UNHCR, because it is outside of Europe. There also I foresee a role for our agency.
Thanks, Rob. We're coming towards the end of this call, so I have two final questions for each of you. Well, one big question. The first is Dublin dead? I think some prominent politicians have already tried to answer that question. And the second is, if you were to look forward 5 years and be clairvoyant for a second, but an optimistic clairvoyant, what would you hope to see from the Common European Asylum System in 5 years' time? And as outgoing EASO director and as president of MPI Europe, what might you think that the EU needs to construct in order to reach a sustainable Common European Asylum System in the longer term?
I like that question. Can I take it in reverse? Because I will end with Dublin. I will start. It's not something very easy. What I would like to see is, without changing everything overnight, but going in the direction we have seen for so many years, that it's common European asylum system should take the next step to a common European asylum area, not only a system but also an area. What does that mean in concrete? That means that if you enter Europe, you should enter not an individual member state, but should enter and ask for asylum in the European Union. That is the step that is a big step, but it is not an impossible step. It is doable, it's organizable. And if you do so, then you can forget about Dublin, because you don't need Dublin. Dublin is a 19th century solution for a 21st century problem. We are not a conglomerate of individual sovereign states that have no other relations than a treaty. It's much more. It's an open area. There are no internal borders for those, at least, who belong to Schengen. There are transnational rights of movement in the old-fashioned Dublin system for very long. It is sustainable, but it's not easy. If you have, and then I'll be very short, but just to summarize what I think is doable using the relocation system. If you enter Europe, cross a border, any entity in the world will ask you to identify yourself. That's nothing abnormal, and even if there are large numbers like in Greece at this moment, it is doable, it's organizable, and it's workable. And that we accept the situation where part of them now walk on without being identified is a very abnormal situation. We should redress that. Identify. Second step is, if you want to have asylum, and if you are eligible for asylum, you ask for asylum at that moment. You cannot ask and go on and ask it in Germany or in France or in the UK or wherever. You can only ask it at that moment. If you don't ask it, you don't ask, but then you are illegal, and then we have different procedures. If you ask it, we decide, and that is the basic system of the common system. We decide who will process your claim. And you cannot escape this. then you don't have the problem with Dimitri correct secondary movements. No, you won't have the possibility for secondary movement because there's no other place where you can apply. You can only apply in an EU center, application center. And then you are distributed. Then remember, it still keep their national decisions on which they are very fun. But at least you have done quite a lot to manage the whole situation. And then Dublin is totally, well, there's no use for Dublin anymore.
So in your view, some form of a European Protection Agency or a European standard would have to be put in place to really get to that future vision?
Absolutely. And you might think about one.
Dimitri, some final remarks.
I think that the facts on the ground has certainly made Dublin irrelevant. So the question is whether to modify it dramatically, rethink it, see what might still be useful, particularly when it comes to responsibilities of one state vis-a-vis the rest of the states. But at the end of the day, if the kinds of things that Rob sees as possible over the next 3 to 5 years, a common, truly common European asylum system that has very similar, if not identical, outcomes regardless, or where the decisions are made at reception and adjudication centers before people get relocated throughout Europe, certainly makes the usefulness or even just the simple use of Dublin unnecessary. In the United States, when a law has outlived its usefulness, we say that it shouldn't litter the law books any longer. You should do away with it. I don't know whether we're at this point. I don't know that some of the big players in Europe will buy into this, but certainly Dublin, as we understand it, won't have a place in the future. Part of the reason that they won't, and something that I want to close with, is the issue of borders. What I see is essentially contrary to what so many of my friends in the academy see when they talk about Fortress Europe. It is a laughable proposition that somehow Europe is a fortress. As far as the eastern half of the Mediterranean is concerned, Europe's borders in the Mediterranean do not exist. They have vanished in front of our eyes in the last 6 to 9 months. And all of the efforts which are incumbent upon us as civilized nations to save people, to protect them, this way they don't die, etc., 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 all of these are commendable exercises, necessary exercises, but they simply contribute to this idea that borders don't exist. And to take this to the logical conclusion, if Europe wants to do away with borders so that it doesn't believe in borders, so that people who come in can come in and those who don't belong still stay, we don't remove them. If that is the case, then what we need to think about is whether we should rethink the whole Westphalian system of states, not doing away with them, but rethinking about what states really are. Maybe we live in Europe, and Europe has created a supranational entity that continuously diminishes the power of individual member states. I don't know whether that's true or not, but certainly this is one way to look at it. But when it comes to external borders in that part of the Mediterranean through which most of the refugees and other migrants come in, I am convinced that there are no borders there. And all of our actions actually contribute to the idea that there are no borders there.
Thank you, Dimitri. And well, I would love to finish a basis upon which the European Union and European states are conceived. I'd just like to thank everyone who's listened to this conversation, and with my apologies for not getting to some of the more technical, specific questions in what has been a very quick conversation, just over an hour. I'd also like to apologise for some of the technical issues that I've experienced, but many of you have experienced. And in that context, may I give the last word to Rob, who may or may not have disappeared. No, Rob's still there. Because some people missed your answer on the EASO role in the hotspots, and whether you could just quickly summarise what the role of EASO is and what it might be in the future. And with our great thanks for you joining us today.
Yes, very quickly. The hotspot is not, as I tried to explain, only about relocation, about redistribution. The hotspot is the consolidated entry point of Europe for large numbers. I think that I can explain it better like this. So it starts with receiving people, checking their identity, checking the reasons why they want to come to Europe, either for migration reasons, for formal reasons, for illegal reasons, for asylum reasons, etc. That is primarily a role for Frontex to support, but as far as people come to Europe in the potential asylum area, there EASO is at the border or just behind the border. Ask for asylum have to be received, be accommodated. Vulnerable groups have to be distinguished and treated differently, etc. That is definitely something where EASO has a role. And certainly for those who are eligible from certain countries of origin, notably at this moment Syria, Eritrea, and Iraq, those are eligible for redistribution, for relocation to other member states, and have the asylum claim processed there. That's not, but that's a challenge, they say. That is not something that can take weeks or months, because then people will just move on. That is the experience. I fully agree with Demetrios on that. So what we have to do is to make sure that it is a process of a week, 10 days, in which people can build up trust. They come now with images that you have to pass first the first countries, the border countries, and then you can apply for asylum. We have to reverse the idea. That is extremely difficult, but if we don't, we never start. We don't see a way of entering if we don't start at the logic of the system.
Thank you, Rob, for that summary, and thank you all for joining us this afternoon. Again, I think we could have gone on for another 2 hours and got into the nitty-gritty of some of the difficulties, particularly those people who can't be returned but also don't qualify for asylum, what to do if someone decides to move on. Many of these questions, I think, still have to be worked out, and perhaps we can come back another day. But suffice to say, thank you both for joining me this afternoon, and Rob, best of luck in your future endeavours, and I hope you don't stray too far from the asylum world.
Thank you very much,
Liz, for your moderation, and great to be with you once more, Rob.
Thank you very much, Demetrios. Much appreciated.
Thank you.